So that's all very exciting and cutting edge and highbrow, but to take you somewhere a little lower brow and a little less cutting edge, about a century and a quarter away from being cutting edge, this evening I am going to make, for the first time on stream, a cocktail, specifically a Manhattan. Now, I did share some of the ingredients beforehand. So if you are making along at home, that's lovely. If not, it's a pretty simple drink, and I would encourage you to, assuming you like cocktails, I would encourage you to try it. So I have all the ingredients and everything here. I am intending eventually to. I have a home bar, and I'm intending eventually to get a camera set up so I can kind of do a, proper zoom in on the bottles and everything nice. But this is a little bit improvisational. And in fact, improvisational is somewhat of a theme of this little cocktail tutorial. So while I do have all of the right equipment and a variety of different options to choose from with as far as boozes go and so forth, uh, it's not always the case that I have everything correct. Well, for example, I am lacking my favourite brand of rye. We are making do with wild turkey. Not that it's bad by any means, but it's just not my favourite. Um, but we do what we must in the quarantine, and in that spirit, we are. I'm going to be telling you about how to kind of make do in the face of inadequate supplies. So, first of off, first off, I'll run through the equipment you need. So, we want something to stir the drink in. The Manhattan is typically made stirred. It's not an absolute requirement, but I would fairly strongly tend towards doing them stirred. If you shake a cocktail, you get a lot more froth in it, which works nicely for drinks that a uh, have a like cream or citrus base to them. But when it comes to sort of strong spirit forward drinks, the texture of a stirred drink does tend to go down a little bit smoother. You will want something to stir with. Oh dear, I've managed to get these all tied up. There we go. So the thing to stir with, I use a bar spoon, though other implements will work perfectly fine. The bar spoon has the advantage of having a like muddler thing on the end, and it's twizzled or at least circular down the whole length, which makes it easier to kind of stir around. Um, then you've got a jigger. This one has little gradations on the inside. You can sort of see those. So little lines on the inside with broken down by kind of fractions of an ounce. Fluid ounces are used quite widely in bartending cocktails because they kind of come over from the US. If you've got a British measure, it'll probably be 25, 30, or sometimes 35 milliliters. I mean, really, any of these will do it. It just depends on how big a drink you want to make, and usually the other side will be double the size of the smaller side. So in this case, I have 1 ounce and 2 ounce. Um, this kind of jigger is rather nice, a loopholed jigger, I think. Um, but uh, basically anything that'll measure appropriate amount is fine. So we've got a question in chat for people who don't know the different cocktails so well, what's the taste profile of the Manhattan, i.e., how would you know if you're going to like it? Excellent question. So the Manhattan is a quite spirit-forward, quite sweet and whiskey-based drink. We'll get to the exact ingredients in a moment, but it uses American whiskey, and it has a bit of a kind of herbal profile to it, but sort of sweetness, nice spirit-forward aspect is what you're going with the Manhattan. Um, it's a proper cocktail, by which I mean it's strong and built around the spirit. So a cocktail, according to close to the original definition, uh, but it's a perhaps a bit more sippable than say an old fashioned, which can be very punchy if you're going for a strong one. Um, you can kind of modulate the intensity of it by stirring more, watering it down a little bit, or you can pour it over ice. I'm not going to be making it that way, but I will mention when you kind of have that option. Um, if you don't like American whiskey at all, you probably won't like the Manhattan, though if you think you don't like American whiskey, it might be that you just haven't tried it in quite the right form. Um, so yeah, let's move on. So you've got your stirring glass, your stirring spoon, and your jigger. Like I say, the stirring spoon, use pretty much anything that's long and thin. It doesn't actually need to have a spoon end. That's just convenient. Like say a chopstick or something will do. And for the glass, I have a lovely sort of crystal cut, fancy Uri glass, um, which my lovely fiance got me last year, I think, for Christmas or birthday. I mix them up, but either way, I get a fair bit of use out of that. However, honestly, any pint glass or sort of similarly sized vessel, or like a mug, big mug, one of those like Sports Direct ones, that would actually work quite well as a. That wouldn't be a bad stirring vessel actually. Because while I do like having all of the fancy, proper equipment, stirring vessel is probably if you're going to like leave one of these to get later and or one of these to cheap out on, that's the one you want to do, because while my lovely crystal glass is very nice, for years I used a Nomic pint glass, one of the ones with the straight sides and the little bulge. For years, I used one of those that I'd stolen from the Balliol College bar. Um, or technically, it was sat outside the bar, so I don't know that it was from the bar. But I stole it while a little bit drunk and never took it back. And I used it to store all my drinks because anything that's got a decent wide base is pretty good. Um, Strainer, I'll actually be using the Julep strainer today. So that is a little curved bit of metal, like a big spoon, but with lots of holes. Um, if you're getting a kind of introductory cocktail set, the Hawthorne strainer is a common alternative. If you're only getting one of the two, I would recommend the Hawthorne, just because it's more flexible. You can do a wider range of drinks easier with that. The Julep strainer is nice and fancy and good for stirred drinks, but considerably less good for most shaken drinks. Incidentally, if you are buying a cocktail set online, or just generally wherever you might buy one, look for a Boston shaker. It's simply a pint glass and one of those metal shaker tins on top. They're very easy to use, and they're cheap and ubiquitous and pretty sturdy. Um, the pint glasses are generally fine for stirring in, and you can use them to shake easier. But we'll probably get to that another week when we do stirred drinks. For now, we're going to focus on sorry, when we do shaken drinks. For now, we're going to focus on stirred. Um, so let's. Oh, and one last bit of equipment. Well, two last bits of equipment. We've got fruit peeler. So this is optional. The Manhattan works nicely with an orange twist or a cherry. If you're going for a cherry, then your work's done. Just plop one in, maybe with a toothpick in. I'm going to be going for an orange twist, so I'll show you how to do that in a minute, although this is simple. Uh, that's just a nice way of getting the peel off, but you can use any old sharp knife. Just, be careful, have an adult assist you if you are under 12. Final bit of equipment, perhaps the most important, is a coupe glass. Well, any old glass will do. I like a coupe glass, which is this kind of hourglass shape. Yeah, yeah. If they're under 12, well, they might be making a drink for their parents. That's a little bit weird, but not technically illegal in most places. Uh, who am I to judge? If you want to enslave your child to make cocktails for you, I'm not a parent. I don't know the struggle. Um, so one thing I would recommend if you can with your glass is, as you can see here, I have some water in it with a bunch of ice. This keeps it nice and cool. Just doing this a few minutes before your that's a good point. Yeah, Mad Men, they have the kids making drinks. So if it's acceptable in the 60s, it's probably fine. Except for the racism and the homophobia and the rampant sexism and but the suits were nice, so swings and roundabouts. Um, so yeah, the glass doesn't really matter the shape that much, like the classic cocktail glass with the straight sides, the kind of classic martini glass, or the coupe are both nice. You want it chilled ideally, but again, that's a bit of a kind of flourish, really. It's nice to have, but not essential. If you are just pouring your drink into a room temperature glass at the end of the day, I'm not going to judge you. Mixing cocktails for your parents sounds good to me. Yes, well, I'm sure they would be very welcome to, very pleased to have you make a drink for them. My dad has gotten pretty good at cocktail making, I must admit. I started teaching him some years back, and he's gotten quite into it, which is wonderful because every time I go back there, now I can demand that he makes me a drink, to test his skills. That's what I'm doing, just making sure he's learning correctly. Yeah. He does make a very solid Manhattan and a very solid Vieux Carré. So if you ever see my dad, random people on the internet, ask him for a cocktail. So I also have with me the kind of star of the show, the equivalent of heat in cooking, which is the ice. I've just got it in a random plastic jug. Ideally, you get this out of the freezer as short as kind of feasibly possible before making the drinks, but it doesn't matter hugely as long as it's still cold. That's the main thing. So we have three ingredients to this drink other than the garnish and the ice. We have rye whiskey. Now this can be any American whiskey really, or any American whiskey with an E. You want one with an E because whiskey without the E has an Irish or Canadian heritage. Though actually, Canadian Club Canadian rye whiskey it makes pretty good Manhattan. Um, so we'll ask him, your dad, when we next see him. I assure you, yes. Next time you see my dad, do feel free to ask him for a drink. Uh, so yes, the whiskey, you want some sort of American, at least North American whiskey. Um, Personally, I like either rye or bourbon that's somewhat rye focused. So something like Woodford Reserve or Four Roses. Four Roses makes a decent Manhattan. My favourite types of rye are Rittenhouse, which I linked before the show, and Sazerac rye is very nice as well. However, being under quarantine rules, I am relegated to some actually perfectly nice wild turkey. It's a little bit low proof at 40.5%, 81 proof in the US, but it's still perfectly good. Um, you also want sweet vermouth. I'm using Cocchi di Torino, which is, I would say, one of my favourite brands. I have quite a lot of favourite brands of vermouth. They vary quite a lot. So, if you're not familiar, sweet vermouth, or vermouth in general, it's a aromatized wine. So, it's lightly fortified to 16% and has a bunch of herbs and spices and so forth kind of macerated in there. And it's very tasty on its own. I would recommend it over ice. Um, and in this case, it goes into Manhattan to make it a sweet Manhattan, which is the default. If you hear just a Manhattan, it generally refers to a sweet Manhattan. What's the difference, I hear you cry? Well, both have vermouth in, but a sweet Manhattan has all sweet vermouth, which is the red stuff. A dry Manhattan has all dry vermouth, which is the white stuff, which you more commonly see in martinis. And a perfect Manhattan has 50% of each. You made me my first Manhattan just after we defeated the Spice Knight, opened a whole new world to me. Yes, indeed, I remember that well. So, for those of you who weren't on my home D&D game several years ago, the Spice Knight was a very mysterious character that I'd built up for a while. Josh here was one of my players, playing Alistair Bodron, a rather kick-ass druid, and uh, they had they had won their battle, uncovered the mystery of the Spice Knight, and Josh was hanging out, and I suggested we have some drinks, and I suggested a Manhattan, and I think it's fair to say that was your real introduction to the world of cocktails, Josh. And you're now one of my most skilled cocktail making friends. So it's something that I've really enjoyed about cocktails is sharing it with other people. It's kind of my most sociable hobby. You know, the only one I can't just do from the well, I can do from the comfort of my own home, but the one that's more fun consistently to yeah, gateway drink to do with friends. And you know that's part of the reason why I'm doing this tonight, because it's nice sharing some cocktail knowledge with you, dear viewer, and yeah, just getting a no, you started me on a daiquiri, maybe definitely rum-based drinks. I started you, Neon Golden, on a caipirinha. That's the first drink we ever had together, which, I mean, it's basically a daiquiri just with cachaça instead of rum, and cachaça is basically rum, um, made with sugarcane juice as opposed to the uh, the molasses, which is the same as rum agricole. Rum agricole and cachaça are basically the same thing, even though anyone from Brazil or Martinique will heavily contest that characterization. But yeah, the yeah, history of my life via cocktails, absolutely. Um, so took a little bit of digression there. The third ingredient is aromatic bitters. So in this case, I have Angostura. You probably have all seen this on the back of, grotty pub bar. Um, and Angostura, generally aromatic bitters, are a concentrated kind of elixir of various spices and whatnot. Um, I think Angostura bitter doesn't actually contain any Angostura bark, uh, though some forms do. The champagne cocktail was amazing. I'm glad you enjoyed Prune Squalor. The champagne cocktail is it's one of my favourites. There's a lot of decadence to the champagne cocktail, and yeah, yeah, bitters are certainly the salt and pepper of cocktails. So you can get a wide variety. And pro tip, if you are lacking on an orange, which can be a pain in the ass to keep in fresh sometimes, then a dash of orange bitters is not quite as nice, but it gets the same kind of tone. So normally I go for a couple of dashes of bitters in my Manhattans, but sort of 2 dashes of this and one of orange bitters will give you that orangey undertone. Right. So what I'm going to do first is I like to measure out my ingredients into the stirring vessel and then add ice. Usually, I'm not particularly persnickety over that, but that's how I tend to roll. So, another pro tip: add your cheapest ingredients first. That way, if you completely cock up and get the ratios wrong, then you've only wasted some bitters or some vermouth rather than your more expensive whiskey. Though sometimes if you do mess up, just make a mental note of the ratios you ended up with, and then make it anyway. See where it goes. Like Bob Ross says, there's no mistakes, just happy little accidents. Unless the drink is absolutely undrinkable, in which case you made a mistake. Just redo it. It's fine. It's the other advantage of drinking at home is it's considerably cheaper, so you can afford to cock up a drink or two. Whereas if you spill a drink at a fancy cocktail establishment, you're down a tenner or more, which is not great. So, a couple of dashes of bitters. To dash, we just upend it and sort of shake in, so like so. Just 2 simple motions like that. You don't need much, just kind of coating the bottom of the glass, little excess in there. Then we're going to do an ounce of Cocchi di Torino vermouth, or whatever your sweet vermouth is. Oh, look at this. I need more cocktail porn sounds, because there's plenty of videos on the internet of cocktail porn visuals, the slow, sensual dribbles of the whiskey into the jigger or into the glass, but the sound of a bottle being opened with a cork is always nice. So we've got an ounce of that, so just measuring out an ounce. This is something you can play around with the ratios of. So in the late 19th century, when vermouth drinks were first becoming popular, for more information on that, go back to my History of Cocktails episode. But when they were first becoming popular, they were often made equal parts of vermouth and spirit. So the original martini was probably something along equal parts of each, with some orange bitters in it. And vary the ratios, or you can go drier and have maybe 0.75 or even zero point 0.5 ounces of sweet vermouth. Then you're kind of getting into making it more of a Manhattan themed old fashioned than a true Manhattan, but doesn't matter. Do what you want. So we've got 2 ounces then of Wild Turkey Rye. Because this is low proof, I'll put in a little bit more, but if you are making it at home with the Rittenhouse I recommended, you can add a little bit more, but it's fairly strong stuff in the first place, so it's not necessary. But again, play with the ratios, see what combination you like most, and at very worst, that's an excuse to drink your way through a few cocktails. Now, if you are making 2 of these at once, just double the quantities, stir for a little bit longer, but it's basically a case of just pure doubling. So I'm going to turn off my mic since I think it's going to be audio poison to get this into the glass, but fill your glass with ice. There we go, you want it nice and full of ice. If you watch actual skilled bartenders do this in a cocktail bar, they'll often add as they go, but they'll also often stir so fast that some of the ice goes flying out. This looks great in the cocktail bar, but if, like me, you are on somewhat of an ice ration, then be sparing with your ice. Don't go throwing it everywhere. But you want the ice to come up above the level of the spirit of the drink mix, and then we're going to put the spoon in and stir. Now, ideally, what you want is the back of the spoon against the edge of the glass, and you want it situated about halfway up the actual bowl of it. You don't want it quite touching the bottom. And then you're going to push forward with the middle finger and back towards you with the forefinger, with your thumb kind of resting up here, and just twisting the wrist, and the actual force that you're putting on the spoon is just a kind of back and forth. You're guiding it along, and the main pressure is on that middle finger and the forefinger, just pushing it forward and pulling it back. And ideally, you don't want a lot of noise coming out of the glass, just nice, smooth stir. And you want to probably keep this up for about 30 seconds until it's nicely watered down a little bit and nicely chilled. One good sign to look for is if the outside of the glass is frosted. That means you're down to about the temperature you want. So we're going to throw out the ice and water in our coupe glass. I'll probably drink that later. And then using our strainer, we're going to strain into the glass. Now, if you don't have a proper stirring implement, don't worry. The back of the thin bit of like a teaspoon will work. Basically anything you can do to agitate it around. If you don't have any kind of stirring implement, you can simply just pour it back and forth from a glass to another glass. That works moderately well. So we've got our strainer in. We're going to just carefully strain into the glass. This is probably watered down a little bit more than I'd usually go for, but still looks fine. So we have our cocktail there. If you are lacking a proper strainer, my advice would be get a fork. Just a fork or a large serving spoon, as long as you can create a gap and keep the ice from falling in. You ideally don't want any fragments of ice in the drink, but if you do have a few, it's it's not the end of the world. And finally, we finish this off with a bit of orange peel. So, I mean, you all know how to use a vegetable peeler, no doubt. Take a modest swatch of orange peel, and then if you just kind of press it like that and You just press it together over the drink. You get these little tiny, I wish I could get a good close-up of this, but little tiny jets of the oils from the orange peel going over the drink, and they sit on the top very nicely and provide a lovely aroma. Uh, Wipe it around the edge of the glass, and for a little extra fun, wipe it on the stem so that your guest gets a bit of orange essence on their fingers, and then it sort of smells nice and it just adds to the overall aroma. Drop it in, and cheers! You have completed Manhattan. Mm, that is an excellent drink. Now, I've had Manhattans from some of the world's finest bars, from Artisan in London, 69 Colebrook Row, and Clu Calais, from Cannon Whiskey and Bitters Emporium in Seattle, various bars in Portland and San Francisco, and really well made Manhattan. Oh, Boadas in Barcelona, of course, one of the finest cocktail bars in the world, if only for its excellent ambience. Um, but there are many, many great places to get the Manhattan, but sometimes the best Manhattan is the one you've just made yourself. So I would encourage you to do so, and cheers. I'll have another sip. Mm.